A nurse mentioned, almost as an afterthought while reviewing paperwork for our second child's delivery, that our 8-year-old son's blood type on file couldn't have come from my husband and me together. My name is Wilhelmina, and that single, offhand clinical observation is the reason I now know exactly what happened during the 11 months my husband spent traveling for work 8 years ago. This story does not slow down. Stay with me. Fast context, because the pace only accelerates from here. My husband Fenwick and I had been married 11 years. We had one son, Aldrich, 8 years old, and I want to tell you plainly that I had never, not once, in 8 years, had a single reason to question his paternity. I was there for the entire pregnancy, the delivery, every part of his life since. There was, from where I stood, absolutely nothing that had ever suggested any question needed asking. I was in the hospital, 39 weeks pregnant with our second child, going through the standard intake and pre-delivery paperwork process. The kind of routine administrative task you barely register while your attention is entirely focused on the much bigger event about to happen. Part of that intake involved reviewing our family's existing medical records on file, including Aldrich's, since we'd requested the hospital coordinate some pediatric records ahead of the new baby's arrival for continuity of care purposes. The nurse reviewing the file with us, clearly not intending to deliver any kind of bombshell, simply working through a standard administrative checklist, paused at one line, frowned slightly, and said, almost conversationally, "That's interesting. It looks like there might be a typo somewhere in here. Aldrich's blood type is listed as O negative, but based on your chart and your husband's chart, that combination isn't really possible genetically. Might be worth flagging with records to get it corrected." I want to describe the exact several seconds that followed, because I think they matter enormously to understanding how completely, instantly my entire understanding of my family reorganized itself. I did not immediately understand the implication. My brain, still mostly occupied with the much larger, more immediate event of being 39 weeks pregnant, initially processed this as exactly what the nurse had framed it as, a records error, a typo, something clerical and unremarkable. "I'm O negative myself," I said, mostly on autopilot. "Fenwick's O positive, I think. Doesn't that work out fine?" The nurse checked the actual genetic logic again, more carefully this time, and shook her head gently. Two O positive or O positive and O negative parents can only produce O positive or O negative children. Actually, that part would work. But there's a note here from Aldrich's pediatric records showing his father's blood type on a separate old form as a positive, not O positive. I think there might just be two different, conflicting records in the system. Honestly, this happens sometimes with paperwork over the years. Probably worth having someone from records sort it out properly. I want to tell you that I initially let this go, genuinely, as exactly the kind of unremarkable administrative confusion she described, and I want to be honest about why. I was 39 weeks pregnant, exhausted, entirely focused on an imminent delivery, and simply did not have the bandwidth in that specific moment to interrogate a records discrepancy that had been framed, reasonably, as a probable clerical error. Our second son, Barnaby, was born 4 days later, healthy, and the following weeks were consumed entirely, as they always are with a newborn, by the specific, exhausting fog of early infant care. I did not think about that hospital conversation again for nearly 6 weeks. I want to tell you what brought it back to my attention, because it was, in its own way, another small, almost incidental detail. Barnaby's own newborn blood type panel came back, as part of routine postpartum testing, and I found myself, mostly out of idle new parent curiosity, while filling out his baby book, comparing his results against Aldrich's old pediatric records, which I'd pulled up on the hospital portal for an unrelated reason. The discrepancy the nurse had mentioned was still sitting there in the actual records, unresolved, and this time, with more mental bandwidth than I'd had in the delivery room, I actually sat down and worked through the genetics of it properly, the way I imagine anyone with a nagging administrative question and a search engine eventually does at 2 in the morning during a stretch of newborn insomnia. What I found, working through actual blood type inheritance genetics rather than the simplified version I'd rattled off half asleep in the hospital, was considerably more concerning than a simple clerical typo. Fenwick's blood type, confirmed across multiple consistent records including his own recent hospital visit paperwork from Barnaby's delivery, was, in fact, a positive, not O positive, as I'd apparently misremembered and told the nurse in the moment. My own blood type was O negative. Genetically, an O negative parent and an A positive parent can produce a child with either A or O blood type, but not, under any standard genetic model, an outright O negative child in combination with certain specific paternal genetic markers that Fenwick's actual full blood panel, which I now, at 2 in the morning, pulled up in full detail rather than relying on memory, clearly showed him not to carry. I want to describe the specific, cold clarity of that 2 in the morning realization, because it was so different from the vague, unremarkable, probably a record's error feeling I'd had in the hospital weeks earlier. This wasn't a simple typo anymore. This was actual, documented genetic data that, worked through properly, suggested a real, substantive possibility that Fenwick was not, in fact, Aldrich's biological father. I ordered a paternity test the following week, using a discreet, at-home collection kit, telling Fenwick only that I wanted to clear up a records discrepancy the hospital had flagged. A version of the truth that wasn't fully dishonest, but that I want to be honest, I chose deliberately, needing, first, to have actual confirmed results before initiating a conversation I suspected, even then, might upend everything. The results came back 12 days later. 0% probability of paternity between Fenwick and Aldrich. I want to walk you through what I did next, because it moved fast, and it revealed worse and worse things the longer I looked. I confronted Fenwick that same evening, the actual clinical report in hand, and I want to describe his reaction carefully, because it was different from what I expected, not the shocked confusion of someone learning something entirely new, but something more like a specific, dawning resignation, the look of a man who had, apparently, been quietly braced for this exact conversation for years without ever fully believing it would actually arrive. "I need you to explain this," I said, sliding the report across our kitchen table. The silence that followed was long enough that I actually had to ask again before he finally spoke, his voice quieter and more careful than I'd heard it in years. "I've known," he said, "not from the beginning, but for a long time. I want to tell you what came out over the following 3 hours, because it reframed 8 years of my own life in ways I genuinely was not prepared for, and it did not stop escalating for a single minute of that conversation." Roughly 9 months before Aldrich was born, Fenwick had traveled for an extended work assignment, 11 months overseas, a genuinely demanding professional opportunity we'd both agreed was worth the temporary separation. I had, during a specific 6-week window roughly 2 months into that assignment, briefly reconnected with an ex-boyfriend, a period of my own life I want to be honest I had never disclosed to Fenwick, believing, at the time, that it had been a brief, private lapse with no lasting consequence, ended cleanly before Fenwick returned home, never meant to affect our marriage in any concrete way. I sat with the specific vertigo of realizing, in real time, that Fenwick already knew about this, had, apparently, suspected it for years, long before any hospital paperwork ever surfaced it clinically. "How?" I asked. "How long have you actually known?" He told me that roughly 3 years earlier, during a routine physical, his own doctor had, in an entirely separate context, mentioned his blood type in a way that had made him do exactly the kind of genetic math I'd just done myself, prompted by an unrelated medical conversation. He had, at that point, quietly ordered his own paternity test, discreetly, without ever telling me, and had received the same conclusive results I now held in my own hands, 3 years before I found out through the hospital's own records discrepancy. "You've known for 3 years," I said, and said nothing. I didn't know how to bring it up without destroying everything, he said. I told myself it didn't actually change anything about how I felt about him. And it didn't, genuinely. It still doesn't. So I just decided, over and over, that telling you wasn't worth the risk of everything falling apart. And I kept making that same decision, year after year, until it became the thing I'd simply decided I was never going to say. I want to be completely clear about something, the same way I imagine anyone who has lived through a version of this story eventually needs to be clear about it. Nothing about that conversation changed how either of us felt about Aldrich himself, not even slightly. He remained, in every practical and emotional sense, both of our son, regardless of the biological reality underneath it. I want that on the record, because I think it's easy to let the shock of a discovery like this overshadow the actual, unchanged truth of the relationship it sits inside. What did change, completely and irrevocably, was my understanding of my marriage. Not just my own 8-year-old secret about the ex-boyfriend, which I now had to reckon with honestly for the first time, but Fenwick's own 3 years of parallel, separate silence. Each of us, it turned out, independently carrying pieces of the same truth without ever finding a way to bring them together. I want to tell you about the months that followed, because they required both of us to hold something genuinely complicated. My own guilt about the original, brief lapse 8 years earlier. Fenwick's guilt about 3 years of separate concealment once he'd learned the truth clinically, and an unwavering, completely unchanged commitment from both of us to Aldrich himself, who remained, throughout the entire process, blessedly unaware that any of this was happening at all, continuing his ordinary 8-year-old life while his parents worked through one of the most complicated periods of their marriage in private. We stayed together, ultimately, Though I want to be honest that staying together required nearly a year of intensive couples therapy, difficult, layered conversations about honesty, about the specific weight of secrets carried separately rather than shared, about rebuilding a foundation of trust that had, we both came to understand, been quietly compromised from two different directions for years before either of us fully knew the other's piece of it. I pursued formal legal confirmation of Fenwick's parental rights going forward, the same kind of process that exists specifically for situations like ours. A non-biological parent who has functioned as a child's actual father for the entirety of his life. And I want to tell you that the day that paperwork finalized was, despite everything else our marriage had been through in the preceding months, one of the clearest, most unambiguously good days of that entire difficult year. I started therapy, individual, alongside the couple's work, about 2 months after that kitchen table conversation, once the initial shock had settled enough to leave room for the deeper processing it required. My therapist has helped me understand something I didn't have language for in those first disorienting weeks. That this situation involved not one secret but two, held separately, in parallel, by two different people, each convinced their own silence was somehow more manageable than the alternative. And that healing from it required both of us to fully reckon with our own individual choices rather than simply processing it as something that had happened to us from outside. I think, more than anything, about that nurse's almost offhand comment in the delivery room, framed so casually as a probable clerical error, and how close I came to simply accepting that framing and never thinking about it again, exhausted and distracted as I was in that exact moment. I think about the version of this story where I never sit down at 2 in the morning to actually work through the genetics properly, where Fenwick's 3 years of separate, private knowledge simply continues indefinitely, both of us carrying our own pieces of the same truth forever, never quite finding the moment to bring them together. It's been about a year and a half now since that kitchen table conversation. My own mother, once I eventually told her the full story, said something I still think about often. She said, "You both made the same mistake, just at different times and in different directions. You decided something felt too dangerous to say out loud, and he made that exact same decision 3 years later about something else." I think the real lesson here isn't really about either specific secret. It's about how much easier it always feels, in the moment, to carry something alone than to risk saying it and finding out what happens next. I've thought about that a great deal since. I think it's the truest, most useful thing anyone said to me during that entire difficult period. And I think it's the thing that ultimately helped both Fenwick and me commit to a genuinely different, more honest way of handling difficult truths going forward, rather than simply repeating the same pattern of separate, parallel silence that had, for years, quietly sat underneath our entire marriage. If you've ever had a routine, almost accidental clinical detail unravel a truth that had been sitting quietly, unaddressed, underneath your family for years, I want to hear about it. I think there's something particularly strange about the specific, modern way these truths sometimes surface now, not through confrontation or suspicion, but through the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of medical record keeping, quietly doing exactly what it was designed to do. 8 years for me, 3 years for him. One offhand nurse's comment. That's all it took to finally bring two separate, private truths into the same room at the same time.